Hello, I am a very poor excuse for a French impersonator, Louis, and I was wondering if you could talk about maybe a Renault this week or something. It would be great. Yeah. Okay, we'll talk about something French. Yeah. Hello and welcome to this installment of Car Nerd Stories. I am Jason Hassett, the aforementioned car nerd, and today we're going to be talking about something very French indeed, which is the Renault 5, which was the best-selling car in France from the year 1972 to 1986, and was also the first ever Supermini. These guys not only invented the hatchback, they also invented the Supermini, and that's pretty cool. And I love French people. I love France. In fact, for the most part, it's pretty cool. Paris people can be a bit annoying. If you hate Paris people, let me know in the comments. But before I jump in, don't forget to like and subscribe, and let's just jump straight into the history of this fabulous car. In the late 1960s, a French designer who worked for Renault called Michel Beau started working in his spare time on a new car design, and that car would go on to be the Renault 5. But as he worked on this and designed it, he just did it kind of as a hobby. However, fortunately for us and for Renault at the time, some executives caught wind of the idea, had a look at the car, and were so impressed that they formally created it into a production development cycle, which means actually going ahead with building concepts and working towards the production era. So the car that he had come up with was something absolutely ahead of its time. What he had come up with was essentially a Supermini. So you got to keep in mind, people in the 1959 Mini had come up with the Mini brand of cars, or the small car, and there still wasn't hatchbacks until 1965 with the Renault R16, which had patented the hatchback style of car. So this was moving on from that hatchback era into what would become known as the Supermini era, and Superminis now are a category of cars which were founded with the Renault 5. They didn't exist before the Renault 5. In fact, the Renault 5 was 3 years earlier than the VW Polo, and 4 years before the Ford Fiesta. So this really cemented the Supermini class. And if you ever wondered where the name Supermini came from, it was essentially a play on the Mini brand. So the Mini was the small car to beat at the time, but this didn't want to compete with such a small car. This wanted to be a slightly bigger, more economical and more kind of family friendly hatchback, and they became known as Super. By the time this car came around, French automaker Renault had gone through its resurgence as a car maker under Lafuccio, who took over after World War II, and he helped the guys design the 4CV and pushed against the government. I actually have a video on that here if you'd like to find out more about Renault's post-war history. And then they had the massively successful Renault Dauphine, both of which were incredibly successful, not only in France but also in other countries, with the Dauphine in particular being successful in the US. And Renault had been having a really good resurgence in Europe, but they had been doing really bad in America. So they decided this would be their re-entry into America, their last kind of fight in America, and it launched over there as the Renault Le Car, which is interesting because Le Car means the car, although car is not the word for car in French. So I guess the only way to make sense of that is that AMC were put in charge of distribution, so that's probably why it failed. But anyway, we'll get into that later on. In terms of looks, this was a boxy little 70s car, about the same size as an AMC Gremlin, but it was a good looking car. The good thing about this car was it's not ugly and it's not ridiculously beautiful. It's just a French Supermini, and it looks that way, which makes it kind of timeless. The good thing about a car design like this is there's nothing quite flary or flashy about it, so it's modern in a way and also timeless in a way, and it would sell to everybody and anybody. The problem is if you make kind of a futuristic looking, or you make something that stands out from the crowd, it doesn't sell as well. And boy did this car sell. It sold 5 million units throughout its history in France alone, so something right was done. And you can tell that they were looking for this very minimal, very normal, conservative design because of the way they built it. If you look at had the backlights there in the normal place, backlights, but Michel Beau actually wanted them on the C-pillar, and that was way ahead of its time. That wouldn't happen for years to come with the 850 Volvo Estate or the Fiat Punto, both of which made that kind of C-pillar designed lighting very, very famous. Unfortunately, the Renault engineers and executives, especially the executives, thought this was a bit too far ahead of its time and decided to leave that be. They also had a few other different interesting features, like the first version of this car had the gear shifter on the dashboard, which is pretty strange. It also had the engine longitudinally mounted, even though it was front wheel drive, which is quite strange when you consider the amount of extra space that Mini had given by making theirs transverse inside the front of the car. So if you want to know more about that, then you can watch my video on transverse versus longitudinal engine patterns, but that's a story for a different time. However, with this car, they mounted the engine behind the gearbox, which again is very, very strange, and we'll talk about it in the engine section. But surprisingly, there was still a lot of room inside the car. And they had also made this car incredibly lightweight. It was a monocoque design as opposed to the body-on-frame type of design that was still going on in the late 60s and early 70s. And even the people who hadn't done it that way weren't doing monocoques. They were kind of lightweight chassis, or they were making whole monocoque frames, but this went a little bit further. It also had a very, very aerodynamic shape, which you wouldn't think by looking at its boxiness, but with slight angles and slight designs that Michel Beau had come up with, the car only had a 0.37 drag coefficient. Now that doesn't sound incredible today when you think like the GM EV1, for example, had a 0.19, and the Bat car that we spoke about the other day had a 0.19, but most cars at that era were 0.45 drag coefficients. So this was actually very, very efficient in terms of aerodynamics, which gives it the credence of being a very highly fuel efficient car for its time. The R5 Turbo 2, which is just an incredible version of this, and it killed it in rallies, was actually redesigned again by Marcello Gandini, and it is a beautiful car that we will talk about at a future episode. And if you'd like to hear more about that, please let me know in the comments. Sadly for Michel Beau, he actually passed away from cancer in 1971, just a few months before this car was released, and never got to see the wild success that it was. But it is a beautiful looking car, and I would love one today. In terms of engine, this car came with a lot of different engines. You could get anything from the 0.8 litre up to the 1.4 litre, I believe it is, and the famous 1.2 with the turbo that was found in the R5 Turbo 2. But again, we'll talk about that at a different time. I'm going to talk about the one that was the best seller, which was the low-level L trim version of this car that came with the 798cc engine, because you could buy this at the time in that trim with that engine configuration for only 10,000 francs or less, which made this a teenager's first car dream. It was so cheap that they would just sell tons and tons and tons of these. They became more popular than the baguette, the croissant, and the cappuccino combined. Fun fact, it's called an Americano because during the war, the Americans would not like the espresso shots because they were too strong, and they would instead add hot water in, giving you the Americano we have today. What about the turbo? I hear the turbo is quite good, no? You're not going to talk about the turbo this week? I thought that was part of the plan. And I know I sound mildly Eastern European and not so much French, but I assure you I am not a high quality French person. Yeah, I will. Okay. Let's get back to cars. So this 798cc engine was nothing if not slow, but it was incredibly economical. It had a 28 mpg range, or mpg fuel consumption, which was amazing at that time. If you imagine in the 1990s, a lot of the American hybrids only had a 25 mpg average, which is insane. So this car, between its light body monocoque, its drag coefficient, and this little engine, was something that you could affordably run on the same budget as your avocado budget would be today. Yeah, I'm talking to you. So this 798cc engine came with a 4-speed manual gearbox, which for the first few variations, as I said, was mounted on the dashboard, which is very, very strange. But it would produce 34 horsepower at a 5,200 RPM, along with 38 pound-feet of torque, which was more than enough to push this little thing along down the French motorways. And it would have an incredible top speed of 75 miles an hour. Not that you'd get there that often, given that it was 0 to 60 times of around 26 seconds. But needless to say, if you had an extra 30 seconds on your hands, you could really kill it with this thing. The turbo would change all that, as I'll go on to in a different video, but that car had a 1.2 litre and it was a rally monster. All in all, this car did really, really well. It sold 5.2 million units in France alone. It also sold another 300,000 to 400,000 units globally, most of which were in the UK. And it entered into America as the Renault Le Car, which doesn't mean the car, it just means the, I think, car in English. But anyway, it was distributed in 1,300 distribution centres by AMC, and it did horribly. They even tried to make a van version of it, but it was really, really bad. And in the late 70s, because of this, Renault decided to pull out of the US market and never actually entered again. So it was a success everywhere except the US. And unfortunately for people in the US who didn't buy it, the global oil crisis means they probably should have. So that is the Renault 5, one of the most popular cars ever made in France. And if you really, really like that car, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Sorry, today's episode is a bit weird. I didn't like it myself either. Not feeling it today. But tomorrow we're going to be talking about something very interesting indeed, which is the BMW E12 or E12 as most people call it, which is the first 5 Series. Very interesting stuff. See you tomorrow.